Today is Saturday, 2nd November, and I intend now today to return to a topic that I discussed in a program I did several days ago, in which I said that certain comments recently made by Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, might indicate that a shift in Iranian policy on the nuclear weapons issue might be underway. Well, over the last couple of hours, a former Iranian official, Dr. Kamal Karazi, who was foreign minister of Iran in the early 2000s, at the time when Iran's reformist president, President Khatami, was in fact the president of Iran, but who is now head of Iran's Strategic Council on Foreign Relations and who is said to be a senior advisor to Ayatollah Khamenei, has now come forward and has made certain comments on this precise issue in an interview he has given with the Lebanese news agency, Al Mayadeen. Now, Al Mayadeen is an interesting website, information source, news agency. I'm not going to pretend that I have a great deal of understanding or knowledge of it. From what I can tell through occasionally checking it, it seems to be fairly closely aligned with the Hezbollah, which is of course an internal Lebanese political movement as well as a militia. However, I'm not going to say that it is controlled by Hezbollah because I don't know, but certainly does seem to be sympathetic or favourable to Hezbollah's cause, and perhaps for that reason it is an obvious place for an Iranian official, or at least someone very well connected to the Iranian leadership, to explain Iranian policy. Now, Al Mayadeen itself has given a very, very fragmented account of this interview. You have to go to many different articles and videos that Al Mayadeen has published in which this interview is laid out. You won't find the entire interview in one place. At least I haven't been able to do so. But we do have one particular extract. This is provided by Al Mayadeen itself, and it does touch on the nuclear issue. This is Al Mayadeen, their account of what Dr. Karazi said. In response to questions about potential changes to Iran's nuclear doctrine, Karazi indicated that such changes are possible, especially if Iran encounters an existential threat. He asserted that Iran has the technical capabilities to produce nuclear weapons and encounters no significant obstacles in this regard. He emphasized that the fatwa issued by Iranian leader Sayyid Ali Khamenei serves as the sole constraint preventing Iran from pursuing nuclear armament. Notice the word sole constraint in this summary of Karazi's comments from Al Mayadeen. Now, an Iranian outlet, which is the Tehran Times, has also provided its account of the interview, and the title reads, "Leader's Advisor Says Iran May Change Nuclear Doctrine If Threats Become Existential." And the article then goes on to say, the advisor to the leader of the Islamic Revolution, and notice that the Tehran Times specifically says that Dr. Karazi is an advisor of Ayatollah Khamenei's. The advisor to the leader of the Islamic Revolution made the remarks in an interview with Lebanon's Al Mayadeen, where he offered insights into Iran's nuclear policy and regional stance. Harazi began by emphasizing that while Iran currently refrains from developing nuclear weapons due to a religious decree, this position might not hold if Iran faces an existential threat. Iran has respected the leader's fatwa prohibiting nuclear weapons, Harazi stated. But if the survival of Iran comes under serious threat, we reserve the right to reconsider. So notice again, reserve the right to reconsider. So Al-Mayadeen says that Khamenei's fatwa is the sole constraint on Iran's ability to acquire nuclear weapons. It's the only thing that stands in the way of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. And the Tehran Times says that Iran reserves the right to reconsider its decision not to acquire nuclear weapons if it judges that its survival is under serious threat. Now, I've actually seen a video which Al-Mayadeen has published in which I've been able to see the full comments that Dr. Harazi has made. And I think they go a little beyond what these two extracts, the one in the Tehran Times and the one published by Al-Mayadeen, actually say. First of all, Dr. Harazi made it very clear in his comments that Iran does possess all the means to develop and build nuclear weapons. He made that quite clear. He said that the technology, Iran does have the technology, it does have the resources, it has the capability to acquire nuclear weapons, and though obviously he didn't provide a timeline, he gave a clear indication that this could be done fairly fast. And he also said that Iran has the ability, if it chooses to acquire nuclear weapons, to use them. He said that Iran has missiles, has demonstrated its missile capability, and that no one basically should be in any doubt that if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons, it could develop warheads which could place on its missiles, and this would not be a problem for Iran. He then went on to say a number of further things, and these are touched on in the Tehran Times article. And I will read the words in the Tehran Times article carefully. Harazi criticized European countries for not reciprocating Iran's respect for their concerns, particularly over missile ranges and regional security sensitivities. Iran no longer feels obliged to consider European concerns, he said, hinting at Iran's growing willingness to increase missile ranges if its own concerns continue to be ignored. By the way, he didn't hint at it. In the video that I have seen, he explicitly indicated that Iran would be willing to extend the range of its missiles. He then went on to say, this is again, I'm taking this from the Tehran Times, Iran no longer feels, Iran's missile capabilities are evident. And if Europe continues to overlook our red lines, we see no need to be bound by their sensitivities. Now, again, the video that I saw of Dr. Harazi's words said that the Iranians have obviously demonstrated their missile capabilities. He was making those points, it seemed to me, clearly in the context of installing the ability to install nuclear warheads on Iranian missiles. But he was also, when discussing the Europeans, he was discussing extending the range of Iran's missiles. And he seemed to be saying that the only reason Iran has not extended, has not increased the range of its missiles beyond what they currently have is because Iran, up to now, has been concerned about European sensitivities. In other words, it does not want, or has up to now chosen not to have missiles with a potential nuclear capability that could reach targets in Europe. But given the way in which the European countries have been siding with Israel, the way in which, in effect, they have been pressuring Iran to show restraint over the course of this crisis, without making similar demands of Israel, the Iranians reserve the right to reconsider that self-imposed restraint they have placed on themselves, in which case they might decide to extend the range of their missiles to cover targets in Europe. And, of course, these are the same missiles that Dr. Kharazi has said might become eventually nuclear capable. So this is a whole succession of rather alarming comments that Dr. Kharazi has made. Now, the Israeli media has publicized them. You can find discussions of Dr. Kharazi's words in places like the Times of Israel, for example. But to my knowledge, the European media has up to now ignored them. I think that is, again, complacent and unwise, because what it seems to me Dr. Kharazi is saying is that Iranian nuclear policy now hangs by a thread. The only thing that is preventing Iran going nuclear is that up to now, Ayatollah Khamenei has made a fatwa basically saying that Iran should not go nuclear. Iran has, up to this time, felt itself bound by Khamenei's fatwa, but note that the Tehran Times says we reserve the right to reconsider. So the fatwa can be cancelled. It can be set aside if the Iranian leadership decides that Iran's survival, as Dr. Kharazi puts it, is under serious threat. And if Iran chooses to go nuclear, it might even go a step further. It might decide to extend the range of its missiles. It has the capability to do that as well. Again, it is a self-imposed constraint that Iran's missiles only have a limited range. Iran has the means to extend the range of its missiles, in which case these missiles could be developed to the point where they could reach targets in Europe as well. Now, I would have thought, as I said, that these are alarming comments. I understand that nobody in Europe wants to spread alarm and fear across Europe. But I think that, as I said, it is dangerous to assume that these are just empty words. After all, we've had many reports in the West about the Iranians possessing the capability to develop nuclear weapons. Every indication suggests that they do have that capability. No doubt it would take them time to do so, but probably not that much time. And of course, if a nuclear weapons capability is achieved, in Iran, then what we're being told here is that it will steadily expand its footprint, and it will start to expand in a way that might bring Europe itself under some potential risk. Now, there's been many comments. I received many comments after I discussed Khamenei's words, and some of them took the view that it was absurd to think that the Iranians had ever really been constrained by any fatwa on Khamenei's part, that the Iranians had always probably aspired to acquire a nuclear weapons capability, that the only real constraint on their actions was fear that if they did press forward with such a development, then they would face an overwhelming attack from Israel and from the United States, determined to prevent Iran achieving a nuclear weapons capability. So I've had people who say that, and I've also had others who say that Iran has never had any intention of acquiring nuclear weapons, that this whole idea that the Iranians are seeking to acquire nuclear weapons is wrong, that the Iranians might go for nuclear weapons if they really did feel that their survival was at risk, but that's not what they feel at the moment. And in the meantime, one shouldn't worry and fret about such possibilities, and that I was over-interpreting Khamenei's words. Well, here we have Dr. Kharazi, who we are told is an advisor to Khamenei himself, and just a couple of days after Khamenei made those words, he's giving an interview to Al Mayadeen, in which he makes it quite clear that the Iranians are indeed, as far as I can see, reconsidering their stance on nuclear weapons. Now, Kharazi also said quite a lot of other things. He again downplayed the effectiveness of the Israeli attack on Iran. He seemed, at least I judged that he seemed, to be cool on the idea of an immediate Iranian attack, a further Iranian attack on Iran. I get the sense that this is the topic of fierce discussion on the part of the Iranian leadership. He also said that Israel has made many mistakes over the course of the last year. It has underestimated the resilience of Hezbollah and Hamas, and that it also has underestimated Iran's own capabilities, both its strike capabilities, as demonstrated by the Iranian missile strike of the 1st of October, and Iran's defensive capabilities, as demonstrated by Iran's allegedly successful counter to ability to repel the Israeli strike on the 26th of October. About the latter, by the way, there are still many, many discordant reports. The Israelis have, of course, picked up the reports about Iran preparing for an attack, a further attack on Israel. The Times of Israel published a fairly lengthy discussion of this. They said that Khamenei has made a decision that there should be another Iranian attack on Israel. The reason the Times of Israel gives for this decision is that Khamenei, shaken apparently by the effectiveness of the Israeli strike, has decided that if Iran doesn't launch a strike against Israel of its own, then in that case there is a real possibility that Iran will lose face and will appear weak, and that is why Iran needs to launch an attack, a further attack, in the way that supposedly Khamenei has decided. Well, that's one view, and it may be true. I want to stress again that about the effectiveness or otherwise of the Israeli strike, I have no real knowledge. I have seen and heard what various people say, what the various accounts are, but ultimately I'm not privy to the inside information, the detailed information that would enable me to form a definitive view on this. I've said I lean more to the Alistair Crook view, which is that the attack was not entirely, or perhaps even very successful, but that's, as I said, just a supposition based on very few facts. I don't think that there is enough information in open sources to reach an absolute view on this. So the Israelis are saying that the Iranians are likely to attack because the Israeli strike was so successful. But I would say that there is the alternative view, which is the one that the Iranians themselves are giving, which is that the Israeli strike was unsuccessful. This is the moment for Iran, however, again, to demonstrate once and for all the scale of its own capabilities, and perhaps that is why the attack, the next Iranian attack, will take place. That is certainly the view that Dr. Kharazi seemed to be expressing over the course of the interview to Al Mayadeen, in the video extracts of that interview that Al Mayadeen has released. Now, the Times of Israel says that the Israelis think that the Iranian attack will take place after the American election. They think that an attack before the election is unlikely because the Iranians do not want to exacerbate tensions immediately before the election in a way that might conceivably work to the advantage of Donald Trump. It's a point of view. It might be true. We will see. I doubt that the Israelis are that well informed about Iranian decision making. And in any event, I suspect that if the Iranians do decide to conduct a further attack, there'll be an awful lot of preparation and discussion that needs to take place. And if, as I suspect, the Iranians obtained a certain amount of help from the Russians in connection with their previous strike, then of course they will need to discuss with the Russians the next attack and get the Russians' agreement to it, and then it will be the Russians who will no doubt play a major role in discussing its scope. But I don't want to dwell too much on this further Iranian attack or what it amounts to in this program. This is all very speculative. Khamenei's words of a few days ago did seem to me to open up the possibility for a rethinking of Iran's stance on its nuclear weapons program. And now we've had these further comments from Dr. Kharazi, who we're told by the Iranians themselves is an advisor to Ayatollah Khamenei. And that seems to reinforce the fact that the Iranians are now in the process of reconsidering their policies. I will finish this by saying, of course, that there is always a possibility, and one shouldn't discount this, that the Iranians are playing a complicated game with the Israelis and with everyone else. They're not perhaps really intending to obtain nuclear weapons. They're just wanting to make us all think that they are. Iran is a very sophisticated political and geopolitical player. It will be certainly within the within Iranian competencies to play a game like that. But for the record, I think these words need to be taken seriously. Harazi spoke about the fact that Iran is not looking for war, but is not going to try to avoid one if war does indeed come. I get the strong impression from the various comments that Iranian officials are making that they now collectively believe that war is coming. And I think that in the context of that belief, a resumption at some level of a program by Iran to acquire nuclear weapons is becoming a distinct possibility. Certainly, I think that whoever is elected president in the United States on Tuesday needs to consider these possibilities very seriously, consult widely, consult with the intelligence community and the other officials of the US government, consult with the Europeans who are being directly threatened here. I mean, if you follow the logic of Dr. Kharazi's words, consult obviously with the US's Middle East allies, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and of course Israel, and decide very carefully in the light of what is happening, what to do next. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this whole matter. Dr. Kharazi's words, to repeat again, have been widely discussed in Israel itself, as one would expect. I think the relative silence with which they're being treated in Europe and in the United States is complacent. Now, let me turn now to that other perennial topic of our programs, of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And we have had a very interesting article today in the New York Times. It is a classic article in some ways of its kind because it manages to combine some accurate reporting with a great deal, in my opinion, of wishful thinking and a general inability to address the actual battlefield realities. It gives a very, very, shall we say, selective view of the battlefield realities. But anyway, the article says this: as Russia advances, US fears Ukraine has entered a grim phase. Weapons supplies are no longer Ukraine's main disadvantage, American military officials say. And then the article goes on to say that American military and intelligence officials have concluded that the war in Ukraine is no longer a stalemate as Russia makes steady gains, and the sense of pessimism in Kiev and Washington is deepening. The dip in morale and questions about whether American support will continue pose their own threat to Ukraine's war effort. Ukraine is losing territory in the east, and its forces inside Russia have been partially pushed back. The Ukrainian military is struggling to recruit soldiers and equip new units. The number of soldiers killed in action, about 57,000. We get these different numbers for Ukrainian losses all the time, none of which, by the way, I think bear any real relationship to the truth. But anyway, there we are. The number of its soldiers killed in action, about 57,000, is half Russia's losses. Again, how do we know that? When you drill down, it's all based on on Ukrainian guesstimates. Media Zona guesstimates might suggest that a figure around 100,000 is not far off from the correct where Russian losses are concerned, though it ought to be said that the actual total that Media Zona has identified is, I think, 78,000, not 100,000 or more. But anyway, But Ukrainian losses, only 50,000, 57,000. But anyway, it then goes on to say, but still significant for the much smaller country. Russia's shortages of soldiers and supplies have also grown worse. What is the evidence of this? There is no actual evidence provided in this article, though it is continuously reinstated. And its gains in the war have come at great cost. And if US support for Ukraine remains strong until next summer, Kiev could have an opportunity to take advantage of Russia's weaknesses and expected shortfalls in soldiers and tanks. But then we have the qualifying and giveaway paragraphs. US government analysts concluded this summer that Russia was unlikely to make significant gains in Ukraine in the coming months as its poorly trained forces struggled to break through Ukrainian defenses. But that assessment was wrong. Russian troops have advanced in the Donbass region. They have clawed back more than a third of the territory that Ukrainian forces seized in a surprise offensive in Kursk region. The number of Russian drone strikes across Ukraine has increased from 350 in July to 750 in August and 1,500 in September. Notice a dramatic increase there. The situation is tense. A Ukrainian major stationed on the Ukrainian side of the border near Kursk, goes by the call sign Grizzly, says, "We are constantly losing previously occupied positions. The enemy has an advantage in men and artillery, and we are trying to hold the line. Gone is the Russian force that repeatedly stumbled as it invaded Ukraine in 2022. The Russian military, according to a senior US military official, has evolved and is on the march. As a result, some American intelligence agencies and military officials are pessimistic about Ukraine's ability to stop Russian advances as Kiev tries to find ways to build up forces exhausted by nearly 3 years of war." And then all the wishful thinking is trotted out. The Russians have supposedly fallen short of their goals. They haven't been able to capture Pokrovsk. They are facing shortages of radar, armored vehicles, and most critically, there'll be shortages of troops, which will come to a head next year. Now, about shortages of radar and armored vehicles, I see absolutely no sign of that. In fact, if you actually follow events on the ground closely, now, what you notice increasingly is long lines of armored vehicles attacking prepared Ukrainian positions from the Russian side. There certainly don't seem to be any signs of Russian armored vehicle losses. And of course, the Kiel Institute in Germany, that discussion of its analysis of the situation and of the Russian production figures, which I discussed about a week ago, it comes to the diametrically opposite conclusion that Russian armored vehicle output is now running so high that not only are the Russians able to replace all of their losses, but they are able to build up more armored forces over and above those that they already have, so that the Russian army is getting bigger and it's getting more tanks and more armored vehicles all the time. And this is enabling the Russians to maintain, not only just to maintain their offensive, but to increase and equip new units all the time. I would add to that the Kiel Institute also said that even though much of the output for the moment consists of refurbishment of existing armoured vehicles, though it must be said some new armoured vehicles are also being built. The Russians are now in the business of setting up and sorting out new production lines, and from about 2027, when the Russians finally do start to run through the stockpiles of old armoured vehicles that they're currently refurbishing, from that point, the Russians will be able to begin new production of armoured vehicles on a very, very big scale. Now, just to add to all of that also, just to say, not only are the Russians producing lots of armoured vehicles and showing no signs of reductions in armoured vehicles, in output of armoured vehicles. The Kiel Institute didn't seem to find any evidence of that. But I've been told from very reliable sources that the great majority of Russian armoured vehicles that get damaged over the course of the fighting, and we often see pictures of Russian tanks armoured vehicles being hit by Ukrainian FPV drones, for example. I mean, they might be damaged. They're scarcely ever completely knocked out. In about 90% of cases, the damage is fairly superficial, and in many cases it can be repaired in field depots, enabling the tank or armoured vehicle in question to be put back into service very quickly. Sometimes the damage is more extensive, and the armoured vehicles, after they've been retrieved, have to be taken back to rear areas and refurbished there. But that also happens on a significant scale. Given that it is the Russians who are consistently advancing, it is they, of course, who are able to recover their armoured vehicles when they're hit and damaged on the battlefronts, because they capture the ground or hold the ground on which those armoured vehicles become damaged. Whereas, since it is the Ukrainians who are retreating, on many occasions, of course not on all occasions, but on many occasions, the Ukrainians have to leave their tanks, their damaged tanks and armoured vehicles behind them, which means that, in fact, it is the Russians who gain possession of them. Now, I've been making that point before, and I would point out that the narrative of the Russians running out of armoured vehicles, well, I can remember it from the early summer of 2022. It's one that gets trotted out every so often, every couple of months. I remember in The Economist just a few months ago, on the strength of an article in the or rather an analysis by someone from the Jamestown Institute, that the Russians would run out of tanks and armoured vehicles as early as August of this year. And here we are in November, and so far, as I've said, there doesn't seem to be any real evidence that the Russians have run out of anything. Now, about radars, I am not able to say, but I have to make one quick observation, which is that I've heard that production of radars is complicated, and quite plausibly, the Russians have not been able to increase production of radars to the extent that we have seen them increase production of other equipment. But neither have I seen that much evidence that the Ukrainians have been successful in destroying Russian radars, especially air defense radars. Again, it is the Russians who are on the offensive. It is the Russians who have air superiority. So why would the Russians be losing radars in large numbers. The Ukrainians, of course, are. But again, to repeat, I've seen little evidence that the Russians are. So anyway, we have this talk always of, huge Russian losses and all of those things. It's something that is always trotted out. And of course, the article talks about the Russians not having captured Pokrovsk. But the Russians haven't yet made an attempt to capture Pokrovsk. On the contrary, they have been advancing elsewhere. They've clearly made a decision back in August that Pokrovsk itself could wait, and they've been working to capture a whole load of other places instead. And this entire article in the New York Times, most incredibly, very, very remarkably, has absolutely nothing to say. There never mentions the capture of places like Ugledar, Selidovo, Ukrainsk, Novogrodivka, all of these places, this huge belt of territory that has fallen under Russian control over the last few weeks. It's as if this battle, this huge Russian advance, which by some reports is the fastest Russian advance, the capture by the Russians of more territory than they've captured at any previous point in the war up to now, if you exclude the early period in February, March 2022. None of this, of course, gets discussed or talked about in this article in the New York Times. But I suppose that always you have to talk things up a little. Part of the purpose of this New York Times article is to try to keep support for Ukraine continuing at current levels. If policy changes in the United States, and there is a huge amount in this article about how a future Trump administration might change policy in over the Ukraine conflict. If policy changes, then you want to make sure that the blame for any eventual Ukrainian collapse falls upon that change of policy rather than on any admission that in fact it is the deteriorating situation of the Ukrainian military on the battlefronts that is the cause. But put all that aside, put all of this manipulation and wishful thinking and guessing of the Russians and picking and choosing which parts of the battlefront you want to talk about. Focus instead on the major admissions. The war is no longer in stalemate. The American and Western analysis that it was has now been dropped. The Russians are advancing. The expectation of American analysts or Western analysts early in the summer that the Russians would not be able to make any significant breakthroughs in Ukraine on the Ukrainian battlefronts. Well, the New York Times straightforwardly now admits that that analysis was wrong. The Russians are continuing to advance. There is a mood of growing pessimism and doubt, not just on the part of the Ukrainians, but in the West as well, amongst Western governments. And all of the indications are, the real indications, as I said, apart from the in place of the wishful thinkings and the imaginary ones, that things are going to get worse. The pessimism extends to Western capitals. Everyone is feeling bad across the board, said Frederick W. Kagan, a scholar with the American Enterprise Institute, who has advised the US military. It has been a very long, hard year and the Russians are still grinding forward. But then he goes on to say that the Russians would like you to believe this is 1944 on the Eastern Front. It isn't. Now, why, as I said, he thinks it isn't, I'm not going to discuss at length. Everybody knows that everybody knows what the situation. I mean, I've discussed what the situation really is, and the article then also, by the way, goes on to say that some problems have now been addressed. That Ukraine now does have enough ammunition. That, by the way, is something that might surprise Ukrainian commanders. It's just that the story about Ukraine lacking ammunition has faded, I think, because it would be very embarrassing if it was continued. And we're told that Ukraine has sharply narrowed Russia's artillery advantage, and Ukrainian soldiers have used explosive drones to lay waste to Russian armoured vehicles. The Russians have probably increased the margin of superiority in artillery firepower. And of course, for every Ukrainian drone now, there are many more Russian ones, just to say. But anyway, we have all of that. But then there is also the admission that the Ukrainians are now short of soldiers. Ukraine's biggest shortcoming now is troops. Ukrainian officials have struggled to put in place a military draft that brings in enough troops. The country has hesitated to lower the conscription age, worried about the demographic impact, and Ukraine has used cell phone numbers, email addresses, and other electronic means to get additional people to register for the military. It has also used more coercive means, like dragging people from concert halls to find and enlist people eligible for the draft. Whilst many have signed up for the military out of patriotism, not enough have joined. We're not given any figures, notice. And Ukraine's failure to give its soldiers any real breaks from the fighting has discouraged people from serving. The Pentagon assesses that Ukraine has enough soldiers to fight for 6 to 12 more months, one official said. After that, he said, it will face a steep shortage. So there it is. They're losing men. The supply situation is nowhere near as good as this article is saying, and the article acknowledges that the assumption that the war was in stalemate, that the Russians wouldn't be able to advance, all of those things that we were being told a couple of months ago, which I and Douglas McGregor and Daniel Davis and Brian Baletic and Scott of Redacted and also of Calibrated, Scott of Calibrated and all sorts of others were saying were wrong. Well, we now see that the New York Times, again, some months after the events, after the fall of Vuhledar, which it won't acknowledge, after the fall of Selidovo, which it won't acknowledge, after the Russian capture of all of this huge territory, the New York Times belatedly is admitting, finally, to all of this. Well, there it is. So that is what we are now hearing from the New York Times. A very bleak, very bad military picture for Ukraine on the Ukrainian battlefronts. Now, what exactly then is happening on the Ukrainian battlefronts? Well, the news is that the Russians are continuing their advance. And the main focus again is on the fighting around Kurakovo and in the southwest Donbass. This again remains the main focus of Russian military operations. I do not agree with the view, by the way, that the Russians are no longer focused so much on Toretsk and Chasiv Yar. Certainly on Chasiv Yar, my impression is that the fighting remains every bit as intense as ever. I think it is also the case with Toretsk, though I suspect that the main focus undoubtedly is southwest Donbass, and that is where the armies are getting the most supplies and the most men and the most machines, and that is why we're seeing the advances there taking place fastest. I have discussed previously that the topography of the region, the fact that we're talking about basically flat steppe land, a little like the American prairies, of isolated communities and fewer forests and rivers and flatter terrain, facilitates movement, particularly movement of armoured forces. And I've also said, and just to repeat again, that in this area, there's less cover. Russian drones are ubiquitous, and general shortages of troops on the part of Ukraine means that the Ukrainians have been unable to create proper defense lines linking up settlements and villages in the way that they have been able to further north, and that has facilitated movement as well. But there's no doubt that the Russians also are giving this area of southwest Donbass a high priority. Now, we have had quite a lot of news over the last 24 hours. Firstly, there are reports that the Russians have begun to push north from the three villages that they've captured, Bogoyavlenka and Novoukrainka and Shakhtarska, and of course Yasnaya Polyana. So there's reports that the Russians have pushed north from Bogoyavlenka and that there is fighting going on in a village just north of Bogoyavlenka called Trudovye. Trudovye, by the way, lies very close to that cluster of villages, Katerinovka, which is now, of course, under Russian control, Yelizavetivka, Ilinka, Romanivka, Vesely Chai, Ganivka, Uspenivka. It's a sort of line of villages. Trudovye could be said to be one of the southern ones of these villages. They form a potential line of defense, which presumably the Russians over the next few weeks will want to break. But anyway, there is now fighting going on in Trudovye. There are even some claims that the Russians have actually captured Trudovye. Though, again, I don't know that that is true. I've not really seen any confirmation of this. And the Russians also supposedly are pushing north from Novoukrainka and Yasnaya Polyana towards another village called Maksimivka, and that they're apparently preparing for an assault on that village as well. Again, all of these villages very much located in open steppe land, easy therefore to encircle. The Russians will flood around them, cut off the supplies, capture the villages, and then following the pattern, they will move on. They will advance further. And north of the Kurakhovo reservoir, the Russians continue to be on the march. The Russian Defense Ministry today has said that the village of Kurakhovka has now been captured. There have been many pictures and film which appear to confirm the presence of Russian troops already in central Kurakhovka, and it was likely that the Russians had captured it about a day or so ago, but now the Russian Defense Ministry is confirming that this village has indeed been captured. That leaves only one village in that cluster of villages northwest of the Kurakhovo reservoir, Vovchenka, which continues to be which has not yet been confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry as being under under Russian control. So the Russians control all of the others: Zoryani, Alexandropol, Kurakhovka, Girnik, and Izmailovka. There are some reports, I discussed them some days ago, that the Russians have already advanced beyond Vovchenka and have reached another village called Ilinka on the northern bank of the Kurakhovo reservoir. I've seen that those reports being repeated again over the last few days. Again, I don't know whether or not that is actually the case, but anyway, those reports are there, and they may, for all I know, be true. So the Russians, anyway, it looks as if they have essentially eliminated this pocket of villages, and they've straightened, as they like to say, their lines. They're very close now, or so it seems to me, to advancing westwards and to gaining control of the entire territory on the north bank of the Kurakhovo reservoir. Now, there's been less news about Russian advances westwards from places like Novodimitrivka and Novoselidivka and Kreminaya Balka. These are villages to the west of Tsukurinye that the Russians captured some time ago. It's plausible that the Russians will push westwards from these places. I've heard that there is one particular village called Sonsivka, which is apparently quite heavily fortified, that the Ukrainians have built up in this area, and that it will be a significant battle for the Russians to capture Sonsivka, and that could slow the Russian advance west and southwards towards places like Andreevka and Constantinopol and all of those. But if the Russians are indeed also pushing north from Yasnaya Polyana towards the Suhi River, apparently there's a river in this area, then it could be that the actual Russian intention is to capture these villages: Andreevka, Constantinopol, Rozliv, Ulakli, on the N15 road west, which leads west into Kurakhovo, from the south rather than the north. This is a very complex operation involving 3 Russian groups of forces, and the Russian command, as a result, has many options it can follow. It can adapt its plans according to the actions of the Ukrainians, and no doubt that is exactly what it is doing. So if they run into obstacles like, say, Sonsivka, if Sonsivka is as well defended as some are saying, north of the Kurakhovo reservoir, then they can advance towards the same villages from the south, and maybe that is indeed what the Russians are planning to do. All of the indications are, and going back to that New York Times article, that for the moment, for the Russians, Kurakhovo is a more important objective than Pokrovsk itself. In other words, the Russians are giving higher priority to the capture of Kurakhovo than they are giving to the capture of Pokrovsk. Once Kurakhovo is captured, once all of this territory south of Pokrovsk, the whole belt of territory, all the way south to Ugleda, is under Russian control, then the moment will come for the Russian attack on Pokrovsk. The Russians no doubt feel that by that point, Pokrovsk will be denied of its hinterland. It'll be isolated. There'll be Russian forces positioned southwest of Pokrovsk in locations where they can interrupt communications towards Pokrovsk from the west. And in that case, the Russians will be able to complete the attack on Pokrovsk. And I repeat my own view that when the battle for Pokrovsk begins seriously, it is going to be a much more straightforward battle, over much more quickly than many people imagine. It's not a heavily fortified town forming part of a whole defense structure, a whole defensive line in the way that Bakhmut, Toretsk, Avdiivka and those sort of places were. So anyway, that's the situation on the southwest battlefronts. There is also news, a lot of news, coming from the area of Kupiansk and from the area of the Oskol and Zherebets river lines. The Russians recently announced that they'd captured a village called Kruglyakivka. They claim to have captured another important village, as I understand it, in this same area today. I'm not exactly sure about the location of this village or even in its exact name, because the Russians and the Ukrainians so often use different names for villages. But it is clear to me that the whole territory along the Zherebets and Oskol riverbanks is now being systematically cleared by the Russians. And according to the military summary channel, the Russians have now finally gained complete control of the area of the high-rise buildings in Volchansk, further north in Kharkiv region. This has been a long and protracted battle. The Russians have been fighting in Volchansk with only part of their forces in the north. The main part of their forces in the north have been committed to defending against the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk region and gradually pushing it back. But nonetheless, the Russians have maintained their offensive in Kharkiv region, in Volchansk, and it seems that they've now been successful and that they're able, therefore, to push towards, to take control of the key places in Volchansk, and that the Ukrainians, by contrast, have been unsuccessful in holding the Russians back in Volchansk, and with Volchansk apparently, with the citadel area in Volchansk, now apparently under complete Russian control. That presumably means that the Russians, who also now control the aggregate plant in Volchansk, will fairly quickly, or will over the next few weeks at least, be able to gain control firstly of the whole territory of Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, and then presumably the rest of Volchansk as well. A long battle for Volchansk, but one which the Russians seem to be now close to winning. Now, on the Kursk operation, a Ukrainian officer, senior officer, Major General Marchenko, has had this to say: "I do not understand what is happening. The best brigades of our army have been thrown into Kursk region. I will tell you frankly, I do not understand it. Perhaps there is some kind of secret plan. I now do not understand what to do next." And well, we saw that Gates, Robert Gates, the former US Defense Secretary and CIA Director, is also saying that the Volchansk, that the Kursk operation was a mistake, a diversion of many of Ukraine's best troops and best armor from the main battlefronts, and that this has left the Ukrainians critically exposed in other places. And we see that Ukrainian officers, other Ukrainian officers, senior Ukrainian officers, apparently senior serving Ukrainian officers, are now in effect saying the same thing. Well, there we go. So the advance continues. The Russians continue to grind forward, and we see that the Pentagon is now saying that the Ukrainians have enough troops to be able to just about hold things together for 6 to 12 months. But beyond that, it will no longer be possible if Russian pressure continues as it is. And there is every reason to think that it will continue as it is. And a number of senior Russian officials are now coming forward and are making comments about the overall political situation and about the war. There's been some very interesting comments from the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. Now, he spoke at the opening of the 16th Russian World Assembly. He said the longer the current Ukrainian authorities, backed by the West, undermine various agreements, the less territory they will retain. In February 2014, if they had fulfilled in good faith what they agreed upon, nothing would have happened and Crimea would be part of Ukraine. He is referring to an agreement that the Ukrainian opposition, as it then was, and President Yanukovych's government came to on the 21st of February 2014, whereby there was an agreement that there would be a general cessation of the street fighting on Maidan Square. The Ukrainian authorities would pull back the police. There would be no further attacks on government buildings and that kind of thing by the protesters. There would then be a period of political calm, followed by elections at the end of 2014, including presidential elections, the date of which would be brought forward. And as the Russians have repeatedly pointed out, had that happened, the high probability is that the opposition, the Maidan movement in other words, would have won those elections. And as Lavrov is then saying, had that happened, Crimea would be part of Ukraine. But of course, they immediately went back. The following day, they went back on the agreement that was reached on the 21st of February. The police were withdrawn. That then led to attacks on more government buildings, even as President Yanukovych himself went away to address a conference of his party in Kharkiv. And of course, in his absence, the entire government in Kiev basically collapsed. So anyway, that's what Lavrov is referring to. And then he says, but they decided to break the agreement as they were eager to change the government as soon as possible. By February 2015, the Minsk agreements, if they had honored those agreements, yes, Crimea had already seceded by that time, but Ukraine would have remained within its borders, including all of Donbass. They did not want to do it because they were unwilling to grant a part of Donbass special status. And it's important to stress here that it was only a part of Donbass at that time. The Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics only controlled part of Donbass, around 50%, less than 50% of it by my recollection, though the two biggest towns, Donetsk City and Lugansk City, were under the control of the two People's Republics. But anyway, they did not want to do it because they were unwilling to grant a part of Donbass special status, which primarily involves confirming the right of the people living there to speak their language. And then there was the Istanbul agreements. The third chance they had was in Istanbul in April 2022. President Putin has spoken about this in detail. Of course, the current situation is now also different from what it was in April 2022. And of course, he's right. We now have a situation where the Russians are in a much stronger position militarily than they were in April 2022. We see that even the New York Times is admitting that the Russian army today is a very different force from the force which supposedly stumbled from one obstacle to another in the spring of 2022. That the Russian army has improved and got much stronger and better in the period since the war since the war started. It's also got much bigger, as General Cavalli says. Again, I am complete loss to understand this view in the New York Times, that this New York Times is now expressing that the Russians are running out of men and machines. Perhaps they should speak to General Cavalli, the US military commander of NATO in Europe. He's expressed the diametrically opposite view. He says that the Russian army today is much bigger and much more powerful than it was in 2022. So he takes the diametrically opposite view to that. But anyway, the other important Russian who has been speaking is Medvedev. And Medvedev also has said that it was possible to reach an agreement to conclude the problem in Ukraine, but the West chose a completely different path. This is in fact a proxy war in which the entire Western world is involved against Russia. And he then went on to say that the West got Russia wrong, that they completely underestimated Russia's ability, that they didn't understand very much about the Russian economy and how resilient it was. And he then has given this warning to who the next president would be. If the next US leader continues adding fuel to the fire in the Russia-Ukraine conflict with the same gusto, that will be a very bad choice because it will be a road to hell. This would really pave the way for a third world war. And he then urged the next president to really reconsider what it is that they're doing. Medvedev, of course, tends to talk in fairly apocalyptic way. And of course, that's what he is doing in this interview. So, no sign that the Russians are moderating their position. And of course, as Lavrov correctly says, with every broken promise, with every broken agreement, what has happened is that Ukraine's position has deteriorated. It has grown steadily worse, even as the Pentagon now speaks of Ukraine having perhaps 6 to 12 months before its manpower losses become unbearable and before the crisis, a military crisis, the real military crisis, truly begins. A Russian military official, a former member of the General Staff, I have forgotten his name, I saw yesterday that he made exactly the same point. He said that for the moment, the Ukrainian army continues to fight. It is still resisting. There is still a lot more grinding to do, but Russia is getting much closer now to the point of final Ukrainian breakdown. 6 to 12 months. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the situation for the moment on the battlefields in Ukraine. Now, there continues to be a lot of discussion about the situation between the BRICS following the conflict, following the BRICS summit, rather, it's not conflict, the BRICS summit that has recently taken place in Kazan. And obviously, and I've discussed this in many places and many times, the core relationship at the very center of BRICS is the relationship between China and Russia. And there continues to be a huge amount of denial about this. And many people in the West still insist that the development of the relationship between China and Russia is not for real, and that there's still tensions between the Chinese and the Russians, or that there are tensions just below the surface. And, well, US Ambassador Mark Green has recently published a long piece, an analytical piece, for the Wilson Center, and I believe it's also the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, and the Kennan Institute. Anyway, he is now finally pushing back on this. I should, by the way, quickly add that I know of this article. It's in a place called Stubborn Things. This is a blog of the Wilson Center, that Ambassador Green has published this. And I've learnt about this article because, again, it has been forwarded to me. A link has been forwarded to me by the historian Jeff Roberts, to whom I am very grateful. And he says that, just behind all of the conflicts that are taking place in the world, the conflict in Ukraine, obviously, the burgeoning relationship between Russia and North Korea, the tensions in the Middle East. What he says, a broader, more dangerous shift may also be underway. China and Russia, with two of the world's largest, best equipped and best funded armed forces, are undertaking joint military projects at an unprecedented rate and in unprecedented places. It seems that what's happening is something some analysts said couldn't happen. The two powers are, to use a colloquialism from my high school days, going steady. And then he mentions the fact that many people for an awful long time went to great lengths to deny that this was a real relationship. They were insisting that the suspicions between the Russians and the Chinese were too strong, that all the protestations of support, mutual support and friendship were really for show. I remember long ago, some years ago, a piece in the Economist calling China and Russia best of frenemies. They appeared to be friends, but they were really enemies. And then the reality, as Ambassador Green says, it is actually completely different. After the normalization of relations at the end of the 1980s, military sales and exchanges between China and Russia rose rapidly. In 2009, for example, 68% of China's arms imports came from Russia, and China's arms purchases from Russia between 2000 and 2010 were 258% higher than the previous decade. But then he goes on to discuss that there is now huge numbers of joint exercises taking place between the Chinese and Russian armed forces. It's in the last decade that the growing military partnership has taken off. In September 2016, just 2 months after the Permanent Court of Arbitration invalidated China's claims over the South China Sea, China and Russia launched South Joint Sea 2016, where they practiced island seizure operations in the disputed waters. And then he goes on to say that there's been more exercises in that place. In 2021, a joint naval exercise involving 10 warships completed a near circle around Japan's main islands. This August, Russia's Prime Minister and China's Premier signed a joint communique on developing joint Arctic shipping routes, as well as agreeing to increase their cooperation on polar ship technology and icebreaker deployments. He says even as the United States discusses with its allies what it's going to do, the Chinese and the Russians could press forward with their work. Chinese H-6 bombers and Russian warplanes entered South Korea's air identification zone without notice, following Japan's 2022 announcement to increase its defense budget. Russia and China held a week-long joint live-fire exercise in the East China Sea. 2024 has brought plenty of signs that military cooperation is only growing stronger. As of July, China and Russia had participated in more than 102 joint military exercises, most occurring since 2017. A recent collaboration involved anti-submarine drills in the Pacific, which Russia says aim to improve coordination in detecting and neutralizing enemy submarines, and increasingly critical skill in modern naval warfare. And then China played a key role in Ocean 2024, Russia's largest naval exercise in 30 years, involving more than 400 warships, 120 aircraft, and 90,000 personnel. Russia, China conduct joint military drills, have entered the US air defense identification zone, coming as close as 200 miles off the Alaskan coast, during their 8th aerial patrol in 2024. And recently, Moscow and Beijing have broadened their cooperation to include other countries of concern to the West, and they've included Iran in the Middle East and North Korea as well. And he goes on to say, it's sometimes hard to discern whether there's truly fire behind the smoke. In a time of growing exchanges of weaponry and fighters between a number of countries around the world, it's sometimes hard to see the transactions as more than being just that, transactions. But when two countries involved are amongst the world's most powerful, and when they act in such strong opposition to long-established priorities of what Ambassador Green then continues to refer to as the free world, and when those two leaders say their friendship will continue for generations, maybe, just maybe, we should sit up and take notice. So twice in this program, you will see that I have referred to analysis, complacent analysis by Western analysts, which we are now told was wrong. Back in the late spring, early summer, all sorts of analysts in the West were saying that the war in Ukraine was in stalemate and the Russians wouldn't possibly be able to advance. And now the New York Times tells us that that is wrong. The Russians have been able to advance, and the Pentagon is worried that Ukraine has only 6 to 12 months left. That's the New York Times. That's in essence what the New York Times is telling us. And now we have Ambassador Green, who says all that talk about China and Russia never really working together, that it was all really smoke and mirrors, that their friendship wasn't for real. Well, actually, maybe it is. They're engaging in all of these exercises all of the time. Their militaries are cooperating with each other all the time. He doesn't even talk about BRICS and about all of the discussions about setting up financial architectures and their burgeoning mutual trade and power of Siberia pipelines being built up and all of that. And he says, maybe, just maybe, all of those analyses of the past, that it was all really smoke and mirrors, maybe that was all wrong. Actually, this is a serious partnership between these two countries after all. When those two leaders say their friendship will continue for generations, maybe, just maybe, we should sit up and take notice. Well, again, if you've been listening to my programs extending all the way back to when this channel began, and when we started to do programs on the Duran in 2018, you will have found lots of discussions between myself, Alex Christoforou and others about all of this, about the fact that the Chinese and Russian partnership was for real. If you go and search hard enough on our website, the Duran, you'll find an article I wrote way back in 2016. Also making that very same point, that the relationship between China and Russia was absolutely for real. And now, rather belatedly, it must be said, Ambassador Green, amongst others, is waking up to that fact. It does seem to me that another thing the new president, whoever that is, needs to do is carry out a root and branch reform of America's intelligence analysis, because it does seem to me that they're getting it wrong an awful lot. Anyway, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And don't forget also to check out our shop and to, if you've liked this video, hit the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.